I get so nervous sometimes when I film because it's literally just me in my room. I mean, like, all my roommates can hear me, but it's chill.
Take a deep breath. That's what I tell myself. I tell myself to keep us singing by the thread.
So it's kind of crazy that I haven't made a video about any Indigenous issue yet. There's already a lot of contention about being a white person in Indigenous studies and a white settler at that. And yeah, it's just a very difficult space to navigate. You might not even live in Canada. You might not know at all what the situation is in the Americas. But I am going to go on this video assuming that you do. So first, a big part of Indigenous research methods is self-location, which is where you just clarify your positionality on a topic or a field of study. So I want to take this moment to clarify that I am white. So white. I'm from Scottish and Irish descent, diasporic descent, at least on the Scottish side because they came from the potato famine. We've been here for a long time, mostly settled in the Ontario area of the Ottawa, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Mississauga? First Nations? Sorry, there's one last one that's slipping my mind there, but anyways, I have also lived in Tsawwassen, on the lands of the Tsawwassen and Wasanic peoples, and currently I live on the land of the Wasanic Texwampek and Lekwungen speaking peoples. So I've lived on a lot of different Indigenous land. I can't talk about Indigenous issues from an Indigenous perspective, and when I talk about Indigenous issues, I'm not trying, at least consciously at all, to absolve any of my guilt or complicity in colonial systems that seek to disenfranchise Indigenous people. So I just want to put that out there. I'm working really hard on figuring out how to activate my own type of decolonization in my daily life. But mostly right now what it is just sharing information on platforms like this, also with my family and friends just on the day-to-day. But yeah, I'm still working on it. It's a work in progress, but I do, like I said, I do want to share this information with you. So I'm going to be talking about Indigenous peoples in relation to the environmental movement today. So I don't know, you might know maybe that I consider myself an environmentalist. Maybe, I don't know. I don't think I've been very clear about that on here. All jokes aside, clearly environmentalism really resonates with me. It always has, not always, but since I was a very young girl, it's always been my thing. Also, my other thing though has always been an interest in Indigenous rights. And I will fully admit that initially when I was young, this came out of a romanticization of what I thought indigeneity as a singularized thing was. Mostly set in Pocahontas. Which obviously now I understand is not good. But honestly, as early as my teen years, I started understanding the social injustices that Indigenous peoples have faced historically and currently in Canada. And I just became very passionate, and I still am, obviously, because that is why I am in Indigenous studies. That is my minor, and environmental studies is my major. So, sometimes environmentalists and Indigenous people, Indigenous nations, disagree on issues. These are typically issues where, I don't know, for example, an Indigenous nation wants to assert their right to a specific resource, like, say, fish in a river. This is typical but also very common. Or trees in a forest. And environmentalists are like, no, 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 you can't do that. So I will admit that I have definitely struggled with that internally before, those issues, because I'm like, well, don't cut down the trees or fish too many fish. But that just came from a place of misunderstanding, which a lot of the environmental movement comes from. So basically what I want to talk about today, which was challenging for myself to research, is why the environmental movement is fucked up and racist. So let's get into it. The environmental movement, the mainstream environmental movement, because there are kind of multiple and little like children of the main environmental movement, it came about really in the 1960s when disaffected American youth, or hippies, expressed their discontent with militarism and environmental destruction. So they were really advocating for 1, peace, and 2, environmental protection. And they wanted this environmental protection to play out in 2 ways. 1, preservation, and 2, conservation. So that really just means keeping wild lands wild. So no human influence. I'll come back to this. Or will I not? No, I will. I'll come back to this. The idea of environmentalism really started to gain traction in the minds of people, and by the 1970s it really was becoming a big movement. 1970 was the first Earth Day, and then a year later, in 1971, the racism officially explicitly started. So, as a commemorative Earth Day campaign, the NGO Keep America Beautiful posted this infamous PSA called The Crying Indian, and I'll show you here. It depicts Italian-American actor Oscar Espera de Corti posing as indigenous, crying, with the caption something like, pollution hurts all of us, take action. And that was the birth of the stereotype that we have grown to call the Ecological Indian. The Ecological Indian is a highly romantic image of the generalized indigenous person as being inherently environmentally minded, living in harmony with nature. So it's this idea that was this image of indigenous people. You definitely know it. Like, you definitely do. It might even be what you think indigenous people are naturally. But it was created by settlers. It was not created by indigenous people. And it was propagated, spread, to meet settler needs. This image was designed to resonate in the settler mind, drawing on fascination with the indigenous other. So through this, the indigenous person, again singularized as though there aren't many very differing nations, became a motif, a dehumanized mascot for the environmental movement. And so really, what they were doing with that campaign was trying to make indigenous people the same as the environment. Like, they're the same thing. And it's, honestly, it's the same racist idea that we've had since discovery of the Americas, where we saw indigenous people as the environment, as these dangerous beasts or savages in nature that had to be conquested, is that a word? Had overtaken just as much as the land needed to be overtaken. Well, it might not be obvious to you, I don't know if you know, but that played into genocide, essentially. Yeah, it did. And this is arguably still a current phenomenon. So, from that image where, like, indigenous people were these savages that we needed to kill off or civilize, this has been refurbished, or was refurbished in the 1970s onwards, to a more romantic image where this indigenous person is still essentially the environment, but indigenous people still have no say in this very publicized idea about what indigeneity is. These early environmentalists, they looked to indigenous people to confirm these ideas about environmental protection that they had really already thought of. Nowhere did these ideas play out more than in the creation of national park reserves. Now, the creation of national park reserves is really symbolic of the whole racism behind the movement and behind the Ecological Indian, because in the creation of these parks, they often, more often than not, had to kick out indigenous people who were living in the parks. They are kicking out these same indigenous peoples that are so extolled by the movement's proponents, that are used as mascots for the movement. And it's made possible because the whole use of this stereotype and previous and other current indigenous stereotypes, it is used to relegate indigenous existence to romanticized spaces in the settler mind, which invisibilizes their presence, their continued presence on the actual land, which also negates any threat to our land title and sovereignty as nation states. So the specific brand of biocentricity, which just means seeing the environment as the center of everything, as the most important thing, like more important than humans. So these aging biocentric ideas of preservation and conservation are particularly dangerous because they revoke the human rights of anyone or anything. They revoke the rights of anything imagined as an obstacle to this environmental protection. It is clear that the mainstream environmental movement only respects or respected indigenous peoples as symbols for the preservationist ideals detached from actual human existence to be exploited in campaigns for public support and ignored when actually trying to assert their rights on the ground. This can be exemplified in 1990 something. 1990 something. Yep. When the Makah Nation tried to resume their subsistence whaling practices on their traditional territories, and environmentalists were like, no. Also in the 1990s, when the Timbisha Shoshone, I might be mispronouncing that, they tried to resume their traditional land management practices on their traditional territories, and environmentalists were like, no, you cannot do that. It is colonial settlers trying to control the ways that indigenous peoples act on their land that we are uninvited guests on. Ironically, through this denial of self-determination and self-identification, the Ecological Indian is just as useful an image for environmentalists as it is for industrial development companies that they're trying to oppose. Because the Ecological Indian, on the one hand, firstly, it is used to hold First Nations to unattainable standards of never touching or using the environment in a capitalist society where we need to use the environment for natural resources in order to participate in the marketplace. And then secondly, on the other hand, the Ecological Indian is used to negate any arguments or protests that Indigenous peoples have against these companies, because they see their assumed wants and desires for the environment, which are assumedly to be preserved, as impractical. And honestly, the racism in the environmental movement is a part of the broader imperialistic legacy of the Americas. Not that environmentalists are consciously implicit in this, but I think they act upon the normalization of indigenous bodies as movable to the desires of settler society, which is a part of the imperialist legacy. So once relieved of the supervision of their parent nations, Canada, the United States, and Mexico carefully sewed environmental racism into their indigenous management frameworks through means of land use, colonial land use, environmental regulation, and private property law. Okay, concluding thoughts, yay! So I've been talking a lot about mainstream environmentalism. It's obviously problematic and can be very racist, but at the same time, there are branches of environmentalism that are good, that show a lot of hope. The environmental justice movement is great. It marries environmentalist objectives with social justice objectives, and it has manifested in many productive alliances between environmentalists and indigenous peoples, which is great. Also, green egalitarianism. It is an ideological branch of environmentalist thought. It has the same social justice focus. Also, it has a feminist analysis of the environment. There's a lot of hope in that. There's a lot of hope in movements that aren't really labeled. Recent movements like Kinder Morgan or Idle No More, the No Dapple protest at Standing Rock, Tom Henley's rediscovery camps. You probably don't know about that, but I'm going to talk about it when I do my book review. And yeah, there's many. International campaigns of embarrassment in Brazil. There's a lot of hope, and honestly, it's changing. Like, it's turning around. People are becoming more and more aware of indigenous rights, and environmentalists are incorporating it into their frameworks and methods, which is great. But I think the main problem behind mainstream or conventional environmentalism is that the whole idea is predicated on this divide between humans and nature, where they aren't the same and they're not on the same plane, and it raises nature up like this, and I'm looking at it like, that's pretty dope. Like, I love nature. I would love if we respected it that much, but we do need to bring humans up to this level, because social issues and environmental issues are inseparable. They are linked, because humans are inseparable from the environment. We are the environment. Yeah, going forward, there is a lot of hope, but it is predicated on conceptions of indigeneity that are not stereotyped, that are determined and defined by actual indigenous people, and that are sustainable and will outlive social fads. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it wasn't too rambly. It is I've been recording for 27 minutes, so we'll see how short I can knock this down to. I also just wanted to take a brief moment to say here that I am planning on uploading a lot more frequently. Maybe like once a week or once every 2 weeks, because I am in school. But just because I want my channel to grow, not for like recognition, because I don't even want people in my life to like see my videos and be like, oh, you're on the internet, and like talk to me about it, especially because I'm already social justice warrior-y enough. No, I just want more people to like receive my messages, and I think the idea of us all being more aware citizens is amazing. I'm honestly learning new things, becoming more aware every day. Like, I'm nowhere near where I want to be, but I'm also happy with where I'm at right now. And you should be too. So yeah, I think that is it. I'm going to film a room tour now. Separate video, don't worry.